Listen to Downtown Hot Radio on the air 24 hours a day and 7 days a week.
You're now tuned into the Real Rap Radio Show. I'm your host, Walil Archer. On Downtown Hot Radio, I have a special guest, Pat Connelly. How are you today?
Fine, Walil. Thank you.
My pleasure. So we're going to talk about your book today.
Yes, I'm quite excited about it.
Congratulations.
The book is actually, there are two books in a series. One is a history of a relatively small frontier New Hampshire colonial town by the name of Rochester for the period 1620 to 1799. And its companion is a complete transcription of the town's colonial records from 1722, the date of its chartering, until the end of the 18th century in 1799.
Now, what inspired you to write the books?
In 1973, I needed a topic for my honors thesis in history at the University of Texas. My major professor, who is a colonial historian, recommended to me that I do it on my hometown in New Hampshire. And I took his recommendation. I wrote to the mayor. The mayor agreed to speak with me. I went to Rochester. He had no indication that there were records at all from the period, so he gave me the key and turned me loose on this 19th century town hall. And I found the original records in cardboard boxes covered by rats in the lowest portion of the cellar, and brought them to light, did some conserving, copied 128 pages of the town book that I needed for my thesis, and then he allowed me to use their materials and photocopy all of the materials I found. And then on the last day, he asked me if I would take possession of these documents, maintain their preservation, and return them to the town at some point in the future where the town was ready to properly deal with them, which I did in 2016. But I wrote these books from the original primary source materials. There's no secondary source as far as the town of Rochester goes.
Wow. Sound like you went through a lot to write them books.
40 years of research. The town records themselves took off and on. I ran a business career in the meantime, so they would have been across the 40-year period. At least 2 weeks every summer, I would go up to the Rochester area, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, to do specific research, and then come back and at my leisure write more and more. But it was 50 years from the date that I found the records until I published, which was 2 months ago.
Wow. Now, what challenges did you face if those wasn't enough, what other challenges did you face when writing these books?
Well, the first and foremost, this is 18th century and 17th century primary source material. The handwriting, the vocabulary, the abbreviations had to be learned and then understood within the context of whether it was written out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony or the New Hampshire province. And again, different clerks have different writing styles. And when you get into sermons, you're talking about ministers with very, very, very small writing on their sermons. Primary challenge was in getting that right, because you can't understand it if you can't properly read it. Secondly was just maintaining the drive to continue through what ended up being 400 pages of transcription text and another 400 pages of what I call a contextual history. If you have the town records, that's wonderful. But if you can't place it into a historical context that people will understand, this is around the period of the French and Indian War. Okay, my mind can comprehend. This is this is in the period of the Revolutionary War. I can understand that. So the history itself has embedded into the description of the town records the history of the time. Were there forest fires? Was there an epidemic? What were the Indian characteristics of the time? Was it an Indian war? Was it a peacetime? Once you start to build those contexts and you incorporate the town records into that, you gradually end up with a readable document. And I hope both of these serve not as an endpoint, but as a seed, so that those people who may come across documents, I mean, these towns in New England, in attics, have tremendous amounts of primary source documents that are buried away. Should one come to pass and they've had some introduction to the period, they might be willing to come forward with that. And subsequent editions of the history would contain that enhanced knowledge.
How many chapters do you have in both books?
The chapters in the history are 6, and the largest is the first, which involves an interpretation of the indigenous Abenaki Indian management of the land before the settlers took hold. And that one has all kinds of consequences. So I expanded it to include an understanding of their culture, of their seasonal transit from the winter grounds through the planting grounds to the summer grounds, and how that affected settlers who perceived land uninhabited as free land. But in fact, it was within the seasonal transit of the Native Americans. So they would start to tear up the ground, start to pull stumps out in order to furrow fields, because they were very fertile planting grounds. And about August, they would have a huge surprise as the tribe came back towards the north and were looking to harvest from these lands, which were no longer harvestable, which meant famine during the winter for the tribes. So these were interesting aspects that I felt needed to be dealt with, because the settlers who came around 1728 to 1734, 35 would have encountered in many of these lands very fertile planting grounds, so they could begin to build their log cabin, and they would be able to get seeds in the ground and eat that fall before they had to move back out of the way for the winter and then come back. We had a first permanent family inhabited in 1728, and that was one out of not many. By 1736, there were 60 families. And that would not have been possible if they had had to clear all of the trees, plant, prepare the furrows to plant the ground, get the seeds in, and harvest. Would not have been possible for them to move in that shorter period of time. So we owe the natives a lot. The results ended up being the same regardless, total dispossession of the Native Americans. But from 1722 forward, it became merely a process of understanding what was going on within the town, who were the officers, which is an interesting discussion. Who were the officers? How long, did they in fact grow control of the town as they maintained the positions in office that they had? Was there a motive? Did they need the power? And in most cases, the answer to that is it wasn't the power that compelled them into office. It was literally growing the town so that they could develop and also to appreciate the land values that were very important to extended families and farming, which became, by the end of the 18th century, Rochester was a major farming community feeding the coastal areas of the province.
Now, what do you want the readers to take away from reading these books?
Well, I'd like them to look at it as a seminal document, something to read, to think about, and then to move forward and further research things that are of interest to them. But for the town itself, the pride that they should have at having developed this town from a frontier settlement, plantation, if you will, all the way into a modern industrialized city by the 19th century. You're talking about survival. You're talking about incredible adaptation. This was on the frontier, consistently under stress, and then after adapting to the environment, basically growing the town to create an attractive place to live. By the end of the 18th century, Rochester was one of the largest towns in the state, right on the cusp of the northern part of New England, where a lot of the development was about to occur. It would go right through Rochester from the coast. So take pride in the town, read about it, and wherever possible, make a contribution to its history.
Sounds good. Now, during the time you was writing either book, did you experience writer's block? And if so, how did you overcome it?
Writer's block was not the issue. Much of the issue was identifying a particular fact that drew frustration because the resources, as you, I'm sure, understand, when you state a fact in a book, there has to be some kind of citation corroboration. These are 18th century facts. For instance, we have a particular road in Rochester, my hometown. We have a road called Whitehall Road, and it has been there for every map as far as back as you could imagine. And the stories that come about as a result of that name are enormous. There's several of them. The one that struck me was that its physical location was at a point from the center of the city all the way to the largest river on the eastern border of the town. It was also the border between New Hampshire and Maine. And in researching that, I found out that the probability is that there was a grant given in the 17th century by Massachusetts into New Hampshire. So one answer that had to be had. Why is New Hampshire granting land? Why is Massachusetts granting land in New Hampshire? Question number one. Question number two, why did they give that much land in that location? And the research of that at Massachusetts Archives was incredibly informing because it enabled me to first identify a missing piece in their archives. They, as you know, when you design a grant of land, you usually bound it, some basic statistics, and then there's a lot of terminology. And in this case, the plot, which is what that is called, was missing. It wasn't identified by number, but you knew it was there because the text was there. So the head archivist at the Massachusetts Archives worked with me for a couple of days, and we manually went through the plots. And on the second day, I found the plot. It was misplaced and misclassified. It had not, this plot in this book has never been seen outside of this book. So this contribution to history is solid and complete. And it's a real joy to be able to tell people that that road, Whitehall Road, was the bottom measured plot of a much larger 2,200 acre plot that was given to an individual who's named in the book as an economic grant so he could develop, pull masts and timber from that part of the town, use Whitehall Road to drag the trees to the river and then move them to Portsmouth down the coast so that they could be shipped to England. Very economically advantageous mast pricing in that period. Okay. But that was singularly the one item that I will focus on because it's really good.
Any thoughts on writing a part 3?
If first of all, I will hold the line at 1800. Once you get into the Industrial Revolution, much has been written about the town. They have pictures. I have very little interest. But if somebody should come up, well, for instance, if one of the other townships that abut Rochester should have an interest in having their town records transcribed and saved, by doing that, I would pick up, obviously, as a consequence of having it adjacent to Rochester, I would have additional information to add. So there'll be a 3, there could be a 4, it might even be a 5. However, I'm 78 years old. You have to take that into consideration.
You look well. You look very well.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated.
And as we begin to close out, where can they purchase the book at?
Amazon.com has all of my books, not just these 2, but the focus is very clearly on extending the invitation to as many people resident of Rochester or interested in small town history, New Hampshire history particularly, and that if they run into trouble, my email address is on the website, rnhcc.com, Rochester, New Hampshire, colonialchronicles.com. Everything that they need is there to acquire a copy of it.
Okay. Any final thoughts or closing remarks?
Thank you very much. It's nice to be able to extend the rationale behind spending 50 years with my nose in Rochester's colonial history.
Sounds good, Pat. Well, Pat, I'd like to thank you for doing the interview today.
Pleasure was all mine, Walil. Thank you.
My pleasure. So that's my time today on the Real Rap Radio Show, and I'll see you guys next time on the Real Rap Radio Show with Walil Archer.
Listen to Downtown Hott Radio on the air 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. Tune in by downloading the Downtown Hott Radio's mobile app. Listen on our website, www.downtownhottradio.com.